On May the 14th, at 8 in the morning, the High Commissioner, Sir Alan Cunningham, reviewed a guard of honor at Government House in Jerusalem. Several hours later, at the port of Haifa, Sir Alan watched the lowering of the flag for the last time. Only a few people observed this ceremony, which marked the end of Britain's 30 years in the Holy Land. On that same Friday afternoon, 5th of Iyar, 5708, May the 14th, 1948, David Ben-Gurion arrived at the Tel Aviv Museum building. His entire life had been directed towards this very moment. This right is the natural right of the Jewish people to be masters of their own fate, like all other nations, in their own sovereign state, which would open the gates of the homeland wide to every Jew and confer upon the Jewish people the status of a fully privileged member of the Committee of Nations. Accordingly, we members of the National Executive, representatives of the Jewish community of Eretz Israel and of the Zionist movement, are here assembled on the day of the termination of the British mandate over Eretz Israel. And by virtue of our natural and historic right, and the strength of the resolution of the United Nations General Assembly, here declare the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Israel, to be known as the State of Israel. The State of Israel will be open for Jewish immigration and for the ingathering of the exiles. It will be based on freedom, justice and peace, as envisaged by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education and culture.
First of all, I wept. Since then, I don't believe that I have shed tears. I had associations from my childhood in America. We learned at school about the Declaration of Independence. Over there, every child knows the preamble by heart and knows of the great men who signed it. And here am I, signing the Declaration of Independence.
This is the original historic recording of Hatikva, the Jewish national anthem, played by the Philharmonic Orchestra at the conclusion of the independence ceremony. Now, for the first time, the words "to be a free nation in our own land" became a reality. We appeal to the Jewish people throughout the diaspora to rally round the Jews of Eretz Israel in the tasks of immigration and upbuilding, and to stand by them in the great struggle for the realization of the age-old dream, the redemption of Israel.
A ship called Exodus arrived in Haifa, loaded with Jewish Holocaust survivors.
Done good war service. But now she had on board some 5,000 Jews who'd hoped to enter Palestine illegally. When she was boarded at sea by the Navy, a fierce battle was fought on her decks, resulting in many casualties on both sides.
The UN committee saw firsthand the immigrants' despair when they were forced to return to Europe. The Jews argued that refugees needed a home and that they would not be welcomed by an Arab state. The UN committee agreed. They recommended that Palestine be partitioned when the British pulled out.
We felt that what had happened to the Palestinians was unjust, and that the division of Palestine was not fair.
The Arabs were outraged.
We had a man called Mustafa Mu'min who managed to penetrate literally into the circle of the Security Council to read a letter written in the blood of several thousand Egyptian Muslim brothers denouncing Israel and the support of Israel and so on.
You all know how to vote. Those who are in favor will say yes, those who are against will say no.
No one relied on the calculations made by the President of the Assembly. Each person held his own pencil and piece of paper and calculated whether or not there was 2/3 for the partition or not.
The United Kingdom abstain. The United States, yes. Uruguay, yes. Venezuela.
And towards the end, during the last countries, USA, Venezuela, etc., we found there was 2/3. We jumped from our places with joy. We wept, we hugged, we kissed.
The resolution of the DUC Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstentions.
I was glad. I was very glad. Because for me, it was important that the UN, according to the Decree of Nations, was granting the Jews, I'd say the Zionists, an independent country on the land of Israel.
And I thought in my heart, history is turning a huge page.
The news was broadcast at 8 p.m. The Palestinian people listened to it everywhere, and there was this feeling of frustration and sadness, a feeling of catastrophe which was about to befall Palestine. Riots and demonstrations started everywhere.
The Arabs attacked Jews and the Jews hit back. Cities and neighborhoods were divided along religious lines. In Jerusalem, an Arab car bomb destroyed the Jewish agency offices. 7 were killed, more than 100 wounded. The 50 Years' War was underway. Palestinian forces from towns and villages along the road to Jerusalem were commanded by Abdul Qadir el-Husseini. They blocked supplies going from Jewish-held Tel Aviv to a besieged Jerusalem. Keeping the Jews of Jerusalem supplied was the first priority of the Jewish army, the Haganah. They tried to defend the convoys.
It was very hard to protect the convoys. We had a huge number of casualties among the convoy escorts, and there was a big waste of product.
When a convoy got through, the whole city knew. The trucks brought vital supplies, flour. We really needed matches and cigarettes. Can you imagine soldiers without cigarettes? We were kept alive by the convoy from Tel Aviv.
We started with military operations to make sure that the road between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem will not be endangered by the big villages or towns that were along the road, where from came all the attackers on the convoys.
A special Haganah brigade was formed to open the road to Jerusalem.
The system was to attack the village, to give warning to the civilians, to destroy the village. And by the elimination of the villages alone and adjacent to the road, we were sure that there would be no attacks.
The Jews tried to seize Kastel, a village controlling the road to Jerusalem.
It was a Palmach unit, my troops, that captured the Kastel. And it was here that Abdul Qadir el-Husseini, the Palestinian leader, was killed.
Enraged, Husseini's soldiers went to recover the body of their leader.
The Arabs counterattacked. Our reinforcements were wiped out. It was a very black day.
Down the road from Kastel, there would be another battle that day. Two Jewish extremist organizations, Irgun and Lehi, which had fought the British, were eager to prove themselves in the new war.
It was such a tragedy. Deir Yassin was a lovely village.
The events at Deir Yassin would haunt relations between Jews and Arabs for years to come. Deir Yassin had stayed out of the fighting. It was not on the Haganah's list of hostile villages.
I ran into a man who had left us for the terrorists. He told me that the Irgun and Lehi had got permission from our commander to attack the village of Deir Yassin. He was very proud.
The Irgun and Lehi forces were ordered to take Deir Yassin.
I ran to my commander and asked, "Why did you allow it?" He said, "I suggested 2 other targets. They turned them down." He said, "I can't shoot them, can I?" So I decided to spy on them.
Their loudspeakers blared out, "Lay down your arms. Run for your lives." Then I heard our machine gun. I was kneeling down like this. When I looked up, I saw the village ablaze. Their attack lit up the whole village.
The village was not the soft target the Jews had expected.
From the windows of their houses, Arabs were shooting at our soldiers. And from a force of 132, we had 42 wounded and 6 dead.
The commander ordered a house-to-house attack.
So I gave the order, Before entering a house, throw a couple of grenades inside. They threw a grenade into one house. 28 were killed.
It was impossible to attack the enemy without hurting their families. It was difficult. It was painful, and I'm sorry we had to do it. But we had no choice.
After the battle, they took 14 prisoners. They lined them up by the quarry and mowed them down. They threw their bodies in the quarry. That's what happened.
While this was going on, Jews came from the next village. Most of them were religious, by the way. They started yelling, "Bastards, murderers, what are you doing?" Some shouted in Hebrew, others in Yiddish. They stopped the massacre.
110 Arabs died in Deir Yassin. Some died fighting, others were murdered. The survivors were taken to Jerusalem.
We gathered in Jerusalem at the Hebron gate. We checked who was missing and who had survived. Then the Palestinian leaders arrived, including Dr. Khalidi.
I asked Dr. Khalidi how we should cover the story. He said, "We must make the most of this." So he wrote a press release stating that at Deir Yassin, children were murdered, pregnant women were raped, all sorts of atrocities.
Arab radio stations passed on the false reports, ignoring the protests of the witnesses.
We said there was no rape. He said we have to say this so the Arab armies will come to liberate Palestine from the Jews.
This was our biggest mistake. We did not realize how our people would react. As soon as they heard that women had been raped at Deir Yassin, Palestinians fled in terror. They ran away from all our villages.
In the next few months, over half the Arab population, 750,000 people, fled their homes in Palestine. Israel never allowed them back. The British did little to prevent the atrocities committed by both sides. As they prepared to leave, they washed their hands of the whole mess. At the United Nations, the Jews announced their plans.
Not later than May 16th next, a provisional Jewish government will commence to function in cooperation with the representatives of the United Nations then in Palestine.
The Jewish leadership sought political support abroad.
The U.S. State Department argued against it. Their first response was, no country, no state.
Ben-Gurion sent his close colleague Moshe Sharett to convince the Americans to recognize the proposed Jewish state. Sharett tried to persuade Secretary of State George Marshall, who was totally opposed to the idea.
Sharett explained that we have no other way than to proceed. This is a historic juncture. If we miss that, we may create a tragedy for future generations.
But President Truman surprised everyone with his strong support.
I was told by all these so-called experts that if it was done, it would involve the whole Near East in a war, and it would also involve the United States. Hitler had been murdering Jews right and left. I saw it, and I dream about it even to this day. The Jews needed some place where they could go. It was my attitude that the American government couldn't stand idly by while the victims of Hitler's madness were not allowed to build new lives.
Marshall was worried that war would break out.
We are in the midst of a very critical situation. We should, therefore, carefully avoid approaching international problems on an emotional basis.
He wanted to maintain good relations with the Arabs.
I was on the receiving end of Azam Pasha's impressions of his meeting with Marshall. And he was happy. I mean, he felt much more reassured about the Americans after having talked to Marshall than before. And we had the Saudis with us. They were our partners in this business.
2 days before the British left Palestine, Truman summoned Marshall to the White House. Clark Clifford was asked to support the case for a Jewish state.
General Marshall started off. The president listened attentively and then said, I would like now to hear from Clark. But as I spoke, I saw Marshall's face getting redder and redder. And when I finished, he exploded.
Marshall accused Truman of a transparent dodge to win the Jewish vote.
Clark Clifford did not disguise the fact that Marshall was raging mad. They don't need a state, they don't deserve a state, it isn't theirs. They've stolen that land. These were Marshall's words.
He turned to the president, said, I'm obliged, Mr. President, to tell you that if you should adopt the policy that is recommended by Clifford, I would be unable to vote for you in this coming election in November. Well, dead silence in the room. No one had ever heard anything like that. I had never heard anybody threaten the President of the United States in that manner.
Before Marshall could go any further, Truman ended the meeting.
I gathered my papers together, and the president said, well, that was tough as a cob.
Marshall said to Charette, well, it's your decision. Don't count that we can bail you out, but we know that you have reached an historic stage, and God protect you.
Eastward, the Arab Legion poised for invasion on the Transjordan border. The rarely photographed King Abdullah reviewed a brigade of reinforcements from Iraq.
Marshall's prediction of war was about to come true. 5 Arab states mobilized on the border, threatening to enter Palestine and crush a Jewish state, if it came into being. For the Jews of Palestine, this was a critical moment. Ben-Gurion was determined to go ahead with or without international support.
I had to act fast. I didn't consult anyone. Today, the British mandate over the land of Israel ends. We declare a Jewish state in the ancient land of Israel. It will be called the State of Israel.
At the same time, the UN's role in Palestine was supposed to end.
When the hands pointed to 6 o'clock, the Iraqi delegate got up and said,
Mr. President,
there is a very important matter to consider before we proceed. The time is 1 minute past 6. Indeed, I think it is 2 minutes. The United States delegate, when he came to this rostrum, declared that if by 6 o'clock we cannot arrive at any conclusion, the whole game is up, and I hold that to you, Mr. President, to give us your ruling. The time is past 6 now.
That was about the only occasion when the Iraqi delegate and I have ever agreed on anything. He was full of exuberance because he thought the game is up and now the road is open for the Arab invasion. I felt that the game is up, and that meant that we were free to establish our state without being accused of impinging upon an international decision.
Then the news from Israel arrived.
This government has been informed that a Jewish state has been proclaimed in Palestine, and recognition has been requested by the provisional government thereof. The United States recognizes the provisional government as the de facto authority of the new state of Israel.
Scarcely had the United States pronounced its words of recognition, and almost unnoticed by our own delegation, which was still celebrating our American victory, Andrew Gromyko rose and said that the Soviet Union, which, unlike the Western powers which had abandoned the Jewish people to its dark and fearful fate, the Soviet Union recognizes the state of Israel. And therefore, I would say that the issue of Israel's recognition was solved almost miraculously within a few hours of our independence declaration.
After 2,000 years of exile, the Jewish people had a state of their own. But even as they danced, Israel's fate hung in the balance. The day after Ben-Gurion declared the state of Israel, the armies of Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria invaded. But the largest Arab army, that of Egypt, had only been tested on the parade ground. At its head was the playboy King Farouk.
The king hadn't had any experience of war. Nobody, in fact, had any experience of war, including the commander-in-chief of the Egyptian army, you see. At the time, a euphoria reigned in the Arab ranks. The boys were very pleased with the war. They thought it was a good idea. But they had no idea of the logistics and the problems they were going to face.
Still, the Arab states, with a population of 40 million, looked certain to overwhelm Israel's 500,000 Jews. It seemed that Ben-Gurion's new state would last only a few days.
We thought it was going to be a pushover, that the Jews were going to run away the moment they saw Arab regular army uniform moving onto them with bayonets and whatever.
Egypt's army, attacking from the south, headed towards the main Jewish center, Tel Aviv. Jordan's Arab Legion took the West Bank and the old city of Jerusalem. The Syrians moved towards Nazareth, while the Lebanese attacked from the north. The Arab regular armies converged on Palestine, superior in numbers and equipment. Early in the war, they had a number of victories. Whenever they overran Israeli villages, the inhabitants were either expelled or killed. The Egyptian army was finally halted only 20 miles from Tel Aviv. The Israelis were fighting for their survival, and after 3 weeks of fierce resistance, they brought the Arabs to a standstill.
We had no aircraft. We had no tanks.
And we were going into war this way. We hardly even had guns. We would try to buy guns as much as we could, anywhere we could. In this situation, we were really saved by Czechoslovakia, that is Russia. America didn't give us arms.
When the weapons came in, the whole balance of power changed. And the Israelis would then pass on to the offensive.
We weren't even mentally prepared. We just weren't ready. So our officers were confused and panic-stricken.
And so the Egyptian army was surrounded, and then the Jordanian army just kept neutral, didn't interfere in any way. Finally, our prime minister here in Egypt, Nokrashi Pasha, was murdered by the Muslim Brothers. And his successor said, with no future in this war, let's make peace.
But there was no peace, only a ceasefire agreement. The Arabs believed a peace treaty would be an acknowledgement of defeat. Both sides mourned their dead. Even before the ceasefire agreements were signed, Israel held its first democratic election. Ben-Gurion and his Labor Party won. Israel celebrated the triumph of its armed forces. But the Arabs refused to recognize Israel's right to exist. For the Arabs, the legacy of the 48 war was the displacement of the Palestinian people. The Palestinians now faced political extinction. The West Bank was annexed by Jordan, and Gaza was ruled by Egypt, which left them with nothing. Egypt, the most powerful Arab country, was shaken by the defeat. A group of young officers, frustrated by the incompetence of the king and the new prime minister, plotted a coup.
I went to the prime minister and delivered the ultimatum to him. He was shocked, believe me, because up till this moment he didn't know that we were going to dethrone the king at all. He was shocked and received me like this. I told him yes. He said, are you powerful enough? I told him yes. Go and deliver it to the king. He must leave by 6 o'clock this evening.
From Cairo come these first authentic pictures of the bloodless coup by which the army took over control of Egypt. It was the end of the king's attempt to maintain power.
As we took the king to the ship, he said, "You ate me for lunch before I could eat you for dinner."
Egypt's new leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser, pledged radical reform.
There were 6 principles: to put an end to colonialism, to put an end to feudalism, put an end to corrupted of exploitation by capitalism.
I read that Nasser was going to Yugoslavia. I thought President Tito could help make peace. I knew a friend of Tito's. I asked him to go to Yugoslavia. I said, get Tito to ask Nasser if he will make peace.
Tito passed on the message. Nasser said that if he was seen talking to Israel, he would be overthrown, even killed.